My name is McKibben, and I'm the author most recently of a book about the relationship between Seaside, California and Fort Ord called Racial Beachhead Diversity and Democracy in a Military Town. And it explores Seaside from the late 19th century to 2006, which is quite a span of time. But before I wrote that book, I began working on the Monterey Peninsula as an historian of immigration, gender, race, and ethnicity by focusing on a particular population in Monterey that formed the central part of the fishing industry here, and that is the Sicilian population. So my first book, I did not pick out this title, but it's called Beyond Cannery Row, Sicilian Women, Immigration, and Community in Monterey, California, 1915 to 1999. And in that book, I really focused on why and how this population of Italian immigrants maintained community over time, even as their cohorts in other cities in the country really blended into the general population, lost a sense of identity as Italians, much less as Sicilians, and moved on, so to speak. While this population really fought to maintain itself and continued to move back and forth from the villages in Sicily that it had originally come from. So I was surprised to find that this entire population of Monterey originated from only 3 little villages on the western coast of Sicily. And I really focused on those villages. I went back and did field work there and tried to understand the persistence of community identity in Monterey. And I came away with an understanding that the sense of identity was based on 2 important factors. The first one was the replenishment of people, this constant replenishment from Sicily. So fishing families intermarried with other fishing families still in Sicily. There was a lot of cousin marriage going on. There was a lot of interaction going on over time. Surprisingly, even during the window of time between 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act that severely restricted immigration and 1965 with Hart-Celler that once again opened it up to family reunification. Even during that momentous time when Italian immigration was virtually cut off, these Italians maintained an identity and connection to the homeland. So most importantly, it was this replenishment of population and constant renewal of population that kept this community alive. But second, and also important, was the work of women within the families to maintain identity, to control what was going on within families, to resist assimilation in a way that meant that if there was out marriage, people from other ethnic or other racial groups that married into the families quickly assumed a Sicilian identity too. So once you married into the family, whatever you were, Portuguese, white, whatever, you were also Sicilian. So this community persisted and the identity persisted. And I looked closely at issues of citizenship, particularly during World War I, and the connections between citizenship and racial ethnic identity formation, and how that became a real issue during the war years when Italy suddenly became an enemy of the United States, and so many Italians in California had failed to acquire citizenship formally. They considered themselves American citizens, but it didn't work so well when they were suddenly designated as enemy aliens. On the other hand, unlike the Japanese, the efforts by the federal government to isolate Italians really failed, and didn't last, the effort alone didn't last very long. It was only about 6 months when Italians were required to move off the coast and live outside of places like Monterey. But Monterey Sicilians sometimes moved to San Francisco. They understood that they needed to move, but nobody was really enforcing the policy very systematically. So they went to San Francisco, which was not really conforming to the edict to move off the coast, but it was not in Monterey. So people just were able to do that. And that's in contrast to the Japanese, who were really rounded up and sent away to the middle of nowhere to be interned in camps throughout the war years. So some Italians, particularly leaders in the Italian community throughout California, were arrested. Many Italians in Monterey lost property during the war years, but most did not. Most were able to maintain community. And through that, there came to be a new understanding of identity in Sicilian Monterey that clung to a cultural affinity with Sicily, and particularly with the villages in Sicily, that women played out in the celebration of festivals such as Santa Rosalia and St. Joseph's that renew Italian identity, but also a political affiliation with the United States. So the idea of a political identity as American citizens is coupled with an ethnic identity as Sicilians. And this only got more intense in the 1970s with a new ethnic renewal. So it was an interesting study, but it was also somewhat frustrating for me because it was so focused on this one group. And I wondered about expanding it to look at other groups, which is how I got into my new work. I wondered what happened to all the Californios who used to live on the wharf, and what happened to these mixed neighborhoods that were so common in Monterey in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And what happened was the Depression and new federal policies on where minority groups could live and how housing was funded by the federal government. So in the advent, during the Depression, before World War II, federal financing for home loans, something like a third of all homes in the country were in foreclosure or in danger of loss. So the federal government stepped in to ensure mortgages for people who were facing the loss of property, but they did so only if those properties were located in areas considered to be safe, as safe investments, and those areas had to be white. And that is how the Monterey Peninsula came to be segregated along racial lines, and it's how people of color began to make their way into subdivisions such as Seaside, which were formerly redlined. So for Seaside, the story of Seaside is connected to the story of Sicilians in Monterey. Sicilians generally, especially Sicilian women, bought property on the wharf in Monterey and elsewhere in Monterey, and literally and figuratively moved out populations of color who then resettled in Seaside. So Seaside, even though it was just as beautiful as Pebble Beach or Carmel, and actually had better weather than Monterey, became the destination site for Southern and Eastern European immigrants who were too poor to live in Monterey, for Mexican origin people who were being pushed out by Sicilian entrepreneurs, mostly women, who were buying property by the city block in Monterey in the 30s as the fishing industry just became very, very important. It was something like a $50 million a year industry in the United States at that time. So as the Sicilians prospered, people of color tended to move out of Monterey, and Monterey became far more segregated, especially with the help of the federal government in ensuring that communities became more homogeneous in order to receive federal funding for home loans. So Seaside was marginalized by the 1930s. Monterey became increasingly white ethnic. By the war years, ethnic people who were considered in the range of the color line that was not quite white found themselves whitened by World War II. And people who were of color, Asians, Mexican origin people, and black people, were segregated into suburbs, but mostly to inner cities. And in this area, they were pushed into Seaside. So Seaside had something like 6,000 African Americans living there between in the 1940s and the 1950s really. And it was the largest population of African Americans between Oakland and Los Angeles. White ethnics tended to live in Monterey. Some also lived in Seaside. But coupled with the huge expansion of Fort Ord during the war years, Monterey as a whole, and Seaside in particular, became military zones, heavily influenced by a military population. Sicilians in Monterey also benefited from the fact that Fort Ord included a prisoner of war camp for Italians. And even though Sicilians were now very careful to identify as politically allied to the United States, this was a welcome addition to the population. Suddenly there were that many more marriageable men available for Sicilian women to pull together families that were Sicilian origin. So it's a very interesting connection on the Monterey Peninsula between the experience of Sicilians who prospered from 1915 into the 1940s through this multi-million-dollar fishing industry, the prominence of Sicilian women in forming community even after the demise of the fishing industry, and the development of a new marginalized space outside of Cannery Row, which was Seaside. So in a sense, these two works are connected. And for the comparison for me, for an expansion of an understanding of race and ethnicity on the Monterey Peninsula, I really had to move to look at Seaside. In the post-war years, Sicilians understood that they really needed to open up the community to other Italians. It couldn't just be a Sicilian community. They needed to identify as American citizens, but they also really took advantage of the new Hart-Celler policy on family reunification. And in the post-1965 years, from 1965 to the 1990s and into the present, Sicilians have moved back and forth, and many Sicilian women, young people, have moved back to Sicily, mostly women, not men, to live there, because Sicily at the turn of the 20th century was an impoverished region, but now it's a resort destination. And a lot of what we see on the Monterey Peninsula in terms of tourism and the service industry exists there too. So it became common practice to send teenagers and young adults back to Sicily to understand their heritage. And many of them married and stayed there. And so what we have in Monterey now is a Sicilian community that's quite alive and well. And mostly that is due to the fact of this replenishment of population. So when we think of transnational populations, we normally think of that as people who come from places in close proximity to the United States, the Caribbean, Mexico, other parts of Central America. But in fact, what we have in Monterey is very much a transnational population of Sicilians. It's easy to go back and forth. And we also, interestingly, have a new phenomenon where people are not necessarily acquiring American citizenship, but coming and staying with a green card or coming as part of a family reunification, and not necessarily going through the stages of citizenship, because it's no longer something that feels dangerous to them not to do. They feel far, far from the days of when they were expelled for being part of a dangerous alien population associated with the Axis powers of World War II. Now Sicilians feel white, they feel safe, they feel proud of their cultural heritage, even as they are patriotic Americans, and yet there's a certain number, a significant new migration of Sicilians who come for work for a few years and go back. There's another re-migration back to Sicily, surprisingly of young people who are finding marriage partners and employment in a resort destination very much like it is here. So there's a lot of back and forth going on now, and that replenishment is an essential component of cultural revitalization.